Today's talk is part of our ongoing virtual lecture series, Global Asia and a Multipolar World, a series that invites outstanding scholars in an array of disciplines in the humanities, social sciences, and beyond to present research on intra-Asian networks and flows of ideas, people, and texts across national and linguistic borders. Our very first speaker of the semester, whom we're delighted to invite virtually to our campus, is Professor Sakura Christmas. Professor Christmas is an assistant professor of history and Asian studies at Bowdoin College, where she focuses on modern Japan with an emphasis on the history of the borderlands, the environment, and Japanese empire. Dr. Christmas has done extensive field and archival research, not only in Japan, but also in Xinjiang and in Inner Mongolia as well. Her cutting-edge research is fundamentally interdisciplinary and translingual, making use of primary sources in an array of languages and putting the field of Japan studies in dialogue with scholarship in frontier studies and the environmental humanities. She's published in prestigious journals such as the Journal of Asian Studies, where her article, Japanese Imperialism and Environmental Diseases on a Soy Frontier, appeared in 2019. And she's currently in the process of finishing her monograph entitled Territorial Natures, the Limits of Imperial Japan in Inner Mongolia, research for which has been supported by an almost prohibitively long list of prestigious organizations, including the ACLS, the Fulbright Commission, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Social Science Research Council, and the Japan Foundation. Her talk today, related, I believe, to her monograph project, is entitled, and it's a wonderful title, Soy Division, Imperial Japan and Improvement Agriculture in the Mongol Land. So Dr. Christmas, thank you very much for joining us. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Will, for this generous introduction. I think I will attempt to share my screen. Is that how it's done?
Be great, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Should be able to do
I'm going to, it's been a semester since I've done this, so hopefully it'll work out. But okay, so here we go. And then I want to play from start. Okay, great. Okay, so no technical difficulties here, it sounds like. So again, thank you so much for having me. The material for this talk comes from my book manuscripts, Territorial Natures, and some of it, towards the end of it, actually is covered in my Journal of Asian Studies article, so you're welcome to check that out there too. All right, so consider the humble soybean. In the early 20th century, this legume had many uses. It nourished humans and animals as food and fodder with its high protein content. Oil squeezed from its seeds acted as a lubricant, as a solvent, as a cleaner, and as a coating agent, specifically for European markets, while the residual cake ended up as vital fertilizer for Asian markets. Regarding this last application, as fertilizer, soy carried elevated amounts of nitrogen since it hosts the symbiotic bacteria known as rhizobia, and that fixes the element from the atmosphere into the nodules of its root system. So soy not only enriches the surrounding soil with the nitrogen that it's attracting, but once harvested and compressed as this bean cake can be used to fortify fields elsewhere. So agricultural scientists at the time, not only of course in Japan, which is one of the main focuses of this talk, but in lots of other places around the world, praised soy as a, quote, green fertilizer in opposition to chemical substitutes that were emerging out of labs and factories. But it is difficult to consider the soybean without also wondering where it came from. And the conventional narrative would say that until about 100 years ago, as many of you probably already know, much of the world's supply grew in Northeastern Asia, which was then known as Manchuria. The desire for this legume as a cheap source of organic fertilizer, vegetable oil, and animal feed drove bean farmers to clear the woodlands and the rangelands aggressively. And from the 1730s to the 1910s, the output of soy grew ninefold. In the next decade, in the 1920s, the surface area devoted to this crop really rose as much as from 15 to 40%. And just before Japan invaded this region in 1931 and set up the client state of Manchukuo, Roughly 7,500 square miles produced 5 million tons of soy every year, and that amounted to 40% of the world's output. And 75% of the soy grown in Manchuria was exported to Europe, Japan, and China. So here we have a map of soy production in Manchukuo right at its heyday, 1926. As you can see from this map, the red zone is the highly concentrated area where most of soy is grown. And then we have like the surrounding gray area, and then further out into the yellow. And each of these colors, of course, denote how much soy is grown per county per year. Let me flip back to the previous slide for a second. As it turns out, a third of this total, both in acreage and in tonnage, came from further west, came from an area known as the Mongol lands. And that consists of the shaded area that you see, and then the area a bit west of that. But it's mostly, as you can tell, when you compare these two maps, that it's the shaded area that we're talking about. So the Mongol lands, these territories historically belonged to Mongol princes and dukes who, over the course of the same period, from the 1730s to the 1910s, but really towards the end of the 19th century, who gradually relinquished their pastures to millions of Chinese farmers who had migrated south from the Great Wall. This encroachment thus had both environmental and ethnic dimensions. We can analyze these changes through Jason Moore's concept of the commodity frontier, or the shifting processes in which the global market incorporates new supplies of land and labor. Commodity frontiers draw attention to rural spaces like the Mongol lands, where the constant search for new sources of energy in ever greater quantities led to the progressive appropriation and the environmental dispossession of places and peoples. And so the soy division in this case, as you can see here, the red, the gray, and the yellow, opened up as this commodity frontier as it moved westward into the Mongolian steppe and northward into the Manchurian plain and ultimately into the Tungusic parts of these forest regions closer to Siberia. So in the early 20th century, the Imperial Japan accelerated the expansion of this commodity frontier when it took over half of the region's railroad network. So in this talk, I will start by exploring with you some of the environmental changes brought on by soy. And then I will dive into how Japanese agronomists began to engineer high yield varieties as the commodity frontier kind of hit its climatic limits in the Mongol lands and their attempts to kind of expand that. And then lastly, I'm going to touch upon the problems of soy exhaustion that resulted, despite soy being this green fertilizer. And finally, in the conclusion, I'm going to offer some thoughts about how the soy division helped shape the eastern boundary of the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, which was founded in 1947. So in the early 20th century, Manchuria and parts of Inner Mongolia rested on what Japanese observers at the time called, quote, the soy economy, Daizu Keizai. Now, in this framing, Chinese wholesalers, the Liangjian, linked local farms to the global market. So their job was to extend high interest loans to farmers for spring planting. They managed transport that carried the beans from rural towns to market centers. They stored crops in towers of rush matting, as you can see here. You can get a sense of the scale from the size of the people or how tall the people are versus how big these bins are. And they operated the oil mills that processed soy into bean cake. Until the 20th century, these wholesalers also facilitated the circulation of soy via carts overland or by junks along rivers from these rural towns to market centers and then eventually to the port of Yingkou. So even though Japan had yet to occupy the region formally, which it then does in 1931, it had already become complicit in extending the soy frontier in the 4 decades prior. Because Japan needed more fertilizer to push its rice and its silk outputs back home to this increasingly ambitious levels, it began to rely heavily on outside sources. So in 1898, the first Japanese company, the Mitsui Zaibatsu, Hiromi Mizuno is working on this right now, began to compete with Chinese firms in purchasing Manchurian bean cake using capital from the Yokohama Specie Bank. And then later, the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu and the oil manufacturers Honen and Nissin, later they joined in this boom. From 1893 to 1903, Japan's importation of Manchurian bean cake leapt from 25,000 tons to 200,000 tons. And the commodity quickly became the leading commercial source of nitrogen for the country, overtaking herring, which had been the previous one. Now, the arrival of the railroad intensified that geography of agricultural extraction, especially so from the Mongol lands. Now, one primary purpose of the railroad was to convey soy out of this region. It was primary, that's the main commodity that's on the railroad carts themselves. So in 1902, Russia completed the Chinese Eastern Railway, which trisected Manchuria. So you can see the T-shaped main trunk right there is the Chinese Eastern Railway. And then in 1905, Japan took over the southern trunk of this network after its victory in the Russo-Japanese War. And it turned over the management of this line to Mantetsu, which many of you might have known as the South Manchuria Railway Company, an all-encompassing corporation, much like the British East Indies Company, that not only ran that transport network, but also intervened in the various sectors that fed into this infrastructure, including, of course, soy. Russia and Japan then competed with each other by offering cheaper fares in order to dominate the long-distance freight of soy from the Mongol lands to their respective tracks to the ports of Vladivostok and to Dalian. In the 1920s, China again tried to regain part of the market by building its own rival network of about 400 miles of track to also draw soy away from the interior. So here we have Vladivostok, here's Dalian, and this is the original port of Inko, which eventually kind of falls to the wayside. Now, the term soy economy does not fully capture the transformative effects on the land. The soy economy, of course, grew alongside a soy ecology. In describing this voracious dependency on nitrogen, Toshiro Higuchi calls Japan an organic empire where soy sped up the archipelago's metabolism in the early 20th century. So as Higuchi argues, quote, the agricultural core sucked up the organic material while transferring the environmental costs of its production to the colonial frontier, end quote. And Japan avoided what he called the biogeochemical crisis by constantly expanding its overall pool of nutrients with an influx of nitrogen from its imperial peripheries. So what we see here is a commodity frontier of nitrogen, right? But Higuchi doesn't really go into depth about what exactly this environmental cost looked like. So this commodity frontier, of course, converted pastoral and boreal ecologies into an agricultural one. Chinese migrants chopped down trees and set fire to the brush and then planted soy to enhance the soil quality in advance of other kinds of crops like millet or sorghum. They added soy to their rotation every third or fourth year because this is a way to replenish the earth with this nutrient. And they stripped Manchuria of half its foliage. So what we're talking about are birch, elm, larch, and oak. They disrupted the migratory patterns of wildlife, the wapiti, which is a kind of elk, boar, squirrels, deer, sable, gazelles, wolves, and displaced the nomadic rotations of domestic herds, so sheep, cows, and horses. Instead, they brought in many, many pigs. And soy not only replaced both the wild and the domesticated flora and fauna, but introduced new microorganisms in the process. So besides the colonies of the rhizobia bacteria that lives on the roots of the legume, parasitic communities that perennially made monoculture vulnerable to collapse likewise proliferated. So these are microbes like downy mildew, Fungi like stem and silk rot. There's also gray, brown, ring, and leaf spot, so many different kinds of spots, and nematodes like the beet cyst eelworm. And these microorganisms would later vex Japanese agricultural scientists who try to cultivate varieties resistant to blight and infestation. Most dangerously, however, as Harayama Akira has conjectured, the agricultural penetration into the steppe brought Chinese farmers in closer proximity to marmots. You may be familiar with marmots as groundhogs, whose bodies carried fleas that hosted the bacteria Yersinia pestis, which of course causes pneumonic plague. And this contact zone between herding and farming ecologies led to an explosive rise in pneumonic plague infections in farming communities along the soy frontier. So from 1910 to 1911, famously, one epidemic killed 60,000 people. From 1920 to 1945, there were 13 more outbreaks, each with casualties ranging from hundreds to several thousands people at a time. And so the soy ecology thus had really deadly consequences, ironically, of course, for the very humans that brought it and cultivated it. Now, if Japanese imperialism accelerated soy expansion through Mantetsu, the South Manchuria Railway, it also intensified its cultivation in the Mongol lands. Mantetsu fostered high-yield varieties in order to fulfill the reproductive potential of this legume, because of course that translated to greater profits. The ideology underlying this initiative was that of improvement. In Japanese, we know of improvement as kairyo, in Chinese as gailiang, and then in Mongolian, where this word is also being used for agriculture and pastoralism at this time, seijila rakhu. So the ideology of improvement dates to the 16th century to England, where new techniques in farming and husbandry brought about the agricultural revolution. And improvement initially meant the Christian duty to increase the fertility of the land through botanical insight and manual labor. And of course, as John Locke famously argued in the True Treatises of Government, by improving the land, one could take ownership of it. That act justified the privatization of the commons, in effect enabling the ruling class to seize what seemingly looked like unimproved land, not only in England, but also in its colonies. And so, of course, the ideology of improvement was really very much in the eye of the beholder of what was unimproved land versus what could be improved or what was improved land. So the aggressive stance of this ideology really begs this question, improvement for whom and for why? And this is what we're going to be learning a little bit more about in this talk, is that improvement actually relied on expropriating indigenous holdings and imposing agricultural systems that disrupted ecological relations already in place. Now, by the late 19th century, improvement began to take place within the confines of a new institutional space. And that space was the agricultural experiment station. So within the agricultural experiment station, livestock and crop specialists explored unfamiliar methods and breeding unique varieties in the miniature before introducing them out onto, say, the open range. Right? And American scientists had first borrowed the idea from England and Saxony in the 1870s. This is a very crude representation. It's actually a bit more complicated than this, but a crude scheme of what's going on here. And then they presented it to Japanese reformers after the Meiji Restoration, most notably by helping set up the Sapporo Agricultural College in Hokkaido. And both American and Japanese consultants then proposed the concept to Qing officials, who then built their first center under Yuan Shikai in Bowdoin in 1902. And then, of course, as Chinese elites transmitted this model of improvement throughout their domain, Mantetsu also set up competing bases in Manchuria at Xiongnuecheng in 1909, and then a larger one at Gongjuling in 1913. as well as an additional 17 branches along its railway by 1934. A third of these farms were located on current and former Mongol holdings. And at each point of the transfer, what we see here is an encroaching foreign power foisting the agricultural experiment station onto rapidly developing states. And those rapidly developing states then adopted the symbol of rural modernity as a way to prove their own civilizational status. So in other words, the agricultural experiment station arrived in the ethnic borderlands through these recursive acts of informal imperialism. So high yield soy sprouted from one of these stations in the Mantetsu network, specifically at Gongjuling. And Gongjuling at the time was the largest agricultural experiment station in East Asia. At its height in 1936, Gongjuling employed 45 Japanese and Chinese workers and maintained a budget of about 200,000 yen. As you can see here from the schematic map of Manchuria, what's circled in blue is Gongjuling, and it's placed on the same level of importance as Fushun, the coal mine, and Anshan, the ironworks, both of which have entire books that are devoted to them that are about to come out in the next year or so. So it's really an important site to consider, and we'll spend more time talking about what was going on at Gongjuling. I'd like to note that there is a cute king soya bean icon over to the left, and it denotes the natural size and color of the bean. And we'll talk more about that yellow pearl in a second. So the center consisted of some red brick buildings, laboratories, barns, and 500 acres of alfalfa pastures. And so here we have some images of what Gongjuling itself looked like from postcards. But going back, I just want to highlight, of course, about the dispossession of Mongol lands, that these 500 acres of alfalfa pastures, these laboratories, barns, brick red offices, whatever, all of that stood on the old grounds of a place known as Darhan Banner, which was formerly a part of the Mongol lands. And what we have here is a 1907 map drawn by Mongol surveyors kind of depicting this space, right? In terms of what this all looked like before Gongjuling itself was established, I believe probably in the corner of it. So Darhan Banner in the 1920s served as a site of intense contestation between Chinese farmers and Mongol herders as the soy frontier was unfolding. There was a major rebellion there in 1927, 1928. Further west from where Gongjuling was located. But that gives you a sense of what is happening in terms of the territorial dispossession taking place. All right, so given this location, Gongjuling halfway in between, these farm ecologies, and then halfway in between with these herding ecologies, right? This gateway into Manchuria, but also gateway into the Mongol lands. Gongjuling stood between these spaces where it could test out domesticated flora and fauna in both agricultural and pastoral settings. And they did that across its 4 departments. The crop sciences, which is, the so-called soy division of a different kind, agricultural chemistry, animal husbandry, and rural management. Now, at Gongjuling, improvement ideology took shape amongst a cohort of Japanese men. And these men all shared the same educational experiences of settler colonialism in Hokkaido, the northernmost island of the archipelago. All but one of the 7 directors of Gongjuling through 1945 had graduated from Sapporo Agricultural College, which again was founded by these American experts. And then its successor, the College of Agriculture at Tohoku Imperial University, which then later becomes Hokkaido Imperial University, or this particular section does. And in Sapporo, here we have an image of their farm station. They had undertaken an American curriculum that presumed Ainu indigenous grounds as untapped wilderness and native crops and livestock as inadequate resources. And so scientific knowledge and modern technology, as they studied it, could reconfigure nature for maximal production. So at the core of their assumptions lay this rationalizing impetus to apply the same techniques of improvement based on perceived geographic and climatic similarities. So when these alumni beheld the Great Plains of Northeastern China, they saw the opportunity to replicate the landscape ideal of the American frontier, or at least the ways in which they had studied it in Hokkaido. And so endless, neat rows of high-yield grains and legumes alongside vast verdant tracts of self-sustaining pasture. And we can get a sense of that romantic dream from this propaganda poster in 1944. Now, one of the directors who had attended Tohoku Imperial University went on to design the ecology of improvement in the former Mongol lands. And so what we're going to be learning about is what happened sort of on the east of that divide. In my book, I cover what happens on the west and the ways in which they go about, quote, improving sheep. But today we're going to be learning about, quote, improving soy. So we're going to learn about Nakamoto Yasuzo, who headed the project to develop high-yield soy for the Mongol lands. And he had graduated from the College of Agriculture in 1911, and he had this brief assignment at an agricultural experiment station in Japan, in Yamagata Prefecture, and then started at Gongjuling in 1915, where he ran the crop sciences unit. He spent 2 years studying abroad in the United States and Europe in the early 1920s. I cannot for the life of me figure out where, but then later became the 4th director of the Agricultural Experiment Station in 1933. Now, Nakamoto strove to maximize the yields of domesticated flora in this formation of vast monocultures across the countryside. He and his assistants selectively bred soy to exaggerate certain traits for overseas markets, namely its bean count for Asian consumers and its oil content for European ones. And so to craft the ideal bean, they sought local varieties as progenitors rather than trying to introduce something completely foreign. And they first amassed samples from farmers throughout Manchuria for their seed bank. And they identified over 500 different kinds of soy based on their physical appearance, the chemical composition, agricultural yield, growing zone, and days to maturity. So these are the various factors that went into the specimens that they picked out. And as you can see here, these hundreds are being displayed right here at a seed fair in 1930. Now, among the myriad of possibilities in this collection, Nakamoto and his colleagues singled out a germplasm called yellow number 4 for its elevated bean count and oil content. So Chinese farmers were already selectively breeding soy, and it's really, I think in this case, Japanese scientists kind of legitimizing that through sort of like their official speak, so to say. The Japanese agronomists enhanced these features further by culling and cultivating generation after generation of its progeny. And then in 1923, after 8 years of research, they finally produced a descendant of yellow number 4 that surpassed its native cousins, and they named it the yellow pearl, the Huangbaoju. And compared to local varieties, the yellow pearl could grow on average 35 instead of 26 pods. Each pod could contain 3 instead of 2 beans. The beans themselves also had an oil content of over 20%, which was a slight increase. And all of these gains amounted to about a 40% higher yield for the crop, which translated, of course, to greater revenue for the Mantetsu, for the South Manchuria Railway in turn. Still, the yellow pearl had its ecological limits. Made for the conditions around the agricultural experiment station, the plant did not thrive as well north of Shuangcheng, as you see in the orange, kind of the orange zone. where it was colder, northwest of Zhangjiatun, this blue area, where it was drier. In order to boost crop yields in these places, Japanese agronomists began customizing hundreds of soy varieties based on the finer gradations of climate. So they cultivated Gongjuling number 555, which could mature 30 days earlier than the yellow pearl to correspond with the shorter growing season in the former Mongol lands up north in the Non River Valley. They also created Gongjuling number 561, which could survive on 12 inches less rainfall. And that was to deal with the frequent droughts in the former Mongol lands of the Harachin and the Horchin tribes to the west. So these engineered degrees of difference between the legumes made it possible for soy monoculture to take hold across this variegated terrain of the region and further into the Mongol lands. So here we have various graphs that they're putting together to show kind of the different days to maturity by variety. As you can see here, yellow number 4 is listed. The yellow pearl is also listed as with other varieties. Now, planting modified beans required more than just the aspirations of the agricultural scientists. They also needed cooperation from the soy growers themselves. And so to encourage propagation, Japanese representatives would give away cartloads of the yellow pearl to farming communities along the railroad. Chinese settlers, of course, at first seemed indifferent, if not resistant, towards adopting this. According to Nakamoto, and unfortunately, we really only have Nakamoto's words to go by here, many of them rejected the yellow pearl because these farmers supposedly didn't understand its advantages or didn't trust, more likely, the specialists who visited them. As for those people that welcomed it, some of them sold their entire crop without saving any seeds for the future. Others were accidentally mixing it with unaltered varieties, and they would thus do undo this decade of selective breeding. But what I think these initial problems are showing is they really reveal the impoverished state of agrarian life at the time, rather than the supposed, quote, apathy and illiteracy of the rural population, which is the way that the Japanese sources themselves describe them. Smallholders and sharecroppers, in fact, saw these soy handouts from Gongjuling as a quick form of relief that would add to the year's harvest. And what it indicated is that they couldn't afford to save a portion for the next season, despite this long-term promise of high yields. Now, in response to these issues, Gongjuling hosted fairs where they invited farmers to attend educational lectures, peruse seed displays, as you saw earlier here, and then enter into soybean contests. So we have here one such fair in 1930. The banner, which says "Huanying" or welcome, has got soy plants kind of wrapped around it. And then the sign itself is made out of yellow and black soybeans that are pasted in to create the Chinese characters for welcome. So at one of these gatherings in December 1930, which we have records of, Mantatsu paid for the travel and the lunch for attendees to learn about the benefits of the yellow pearl. They gave out prizes of blankets, dishes, and towels to over 400 competitors. As you can see here some of these Chinese contestants who have, brought their own specimens of what they've been growing, and they've received these various prizes as a result. And Mantatsu also enlisted the help of wealthy elites who would store the surplus of the crop for their poorer neighbors. And they set up an exchange system where people could trade in their native beans for improved ones in order to keep these pools separated. Now, because of these programs, high yield varieties of soy eventually took hold, and they spread really quickly along the Mantatsu corridor. So what you see here is the corridor, with the help of Gongjuling employees who brought the yellow pearl to its villages and its hamlets. By 1935, the crop, the yellow pearl and its improved varieties occupied 1,500 square miles in Manchukuo. 2/3 of that mileage was located in former Mongol lands of the Gorlos, and Horchan tribes. 70% of the 600,000 tons of high-yield beans grown that year, moreover, came from this region alone. So what these statistics are showing is that the former Mongol lands bore the brunt of soy experimentation in Manchukuo. Like, this is where that they were pushing against the climatic limits of the commodity frontier. Okay, so in the Japanese records, though, the first signs of soil exhaustion in the Mongol lands actually appeared a little bit later in November 1935. And that had to do with a collision of different factors, sort of medical infrastructure to be put in place. In fact, the signs were there all along. They just hadn't discovered it yet. And what had happened was that month, there was a mysterious illness that struck the Chinese population of Keshan, which is further up north. And victims first suffered from fever, headaches, dizziness, cold limbs, chest pains, and nausea. And from the onset of these symptoms, most people, after vomiting up yellow liquid, died within 2 days. It was really a horrific condition. Half of them were women between the ages of 16 and 35. And of the 130 known cases in Keshan and the surrounding 6 counties that year, 128 people had perished. Japanese observers at the time named it Keshan disease after the location of the outbreak. And here we have an X-ray kind of measuring out the symptoms, of one of them being an enlarged heart. Now, Keshan actually stood on former Mongol lands, where the majority of its agricultural output consisted of soy for export, meaning that some of the minerals taken in by the crop from the soil never made it back to its place of origin, right? It went out all over the world and never made it back home. And unbeknownst to Japanese occupiers at the time, this wide swath of territory had a very specific geological profile, and it was one that happened to be deficient in selenium, a trace element that is critical for human bodies to function. And you probably don't know this, but you intake selenium every day to prevent Keshan disease from happening. But by 1938, hundreds of these cases had appeared across 20 different counties in the former Mongol lands. So along this sort of border region, Chinese records document, quote, heaps of bodies left from the outbreaks of, quote, vomiting yellow water disease. That's how they called the disease at the time. And that, of course, led to, desolate descriptions of bachelor villages and streets of broken lineages. One folk song of the time lamented that the sickness moved into this one village called Wangxiatun, stoked cooking fires, leaving wives dead and children scattered, with only single men remaining. Now, the farmers in Keshan and these other counties sent soy and other crops to urban centers elsewhere and abroad. And so selenium deficiency would not have posed any danger to these outside consumers. They were eating a varied diet drawn from multiple markets. But for those living in Keshan, the nutritional risk, of course, was substantial. So in the shift of the land from herding to intensive farming, their dietary patterns became less diverse, both in content and the origin of the food. The Mongol herders that had once lived in Keshan ate a lot of meat and dairy, which can prevent selenium deficiency. And they also traded for grain from regional markets. But by contrast, the Chinese homesteaders, they were eating vegetables and grains from their backyards that they had made themselves. So these are gruel or pancakes made from millet, as well as tofu, daikon, and cabbage. And then the rest of their crops left in one direction from the site of extraction to other parts of the empire and beyond. And that, of course, worsened the shortage in selenium. So soybeans offered the green promise of returning nitrogen to the soil as this form of improvement, but just as likely hastened this yellow demise of their cultivators by removing selenium from the earth. And it would take another 40 years to understand some of the causes of Keshan disease and bring this affliction to the end, or to its end. So in conclusion, Japanese imperialism reconfigured local relationships to the land and market, as I've shown, and it created this extractive periphery out of the Mongol lands to meet the global appetite for food, for fuel, and for fertilizer. With Mongols migrating out of this area and Chinese moving in, the cultivation of soybeans in particular began to replace hunting and herding as the primary means of livelihood. In 1932, just after the Japanese occupiers set up the state of Manchukuo, they began to negotiate with restive Mongol leaders who lived in the western third of the country. And they began to negotiate with them about creating an autonomous province as a way to keep them from becoming or declaring independence. The line that they drew took into account not only the ethnic distribution of the residents at that time, but also their forms of livelihood. Were they farmers, or were they herders, or were they some mixture of both? And that demarcation followed the contours of the soy division. And it's one that later carried over and hardened as the eastern border of the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region in 1947. But rather than arguing for an environmental determinism to this border, that the climate or the crop laid down this line, this talk is suggesting the ways in which Japanese agronomists were tinkering with soy to try to push that limit in a very human way further west and further north. So Imperial Japan really shaped its course. The important thing to note here is that the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, of course, the first of the 5 major regions now in the People's Republic of China, even though it was founded in 1947 as the supposed, invention of the communists after the revolution, taking inspiration from the Soviet Union, in fact, had some sort of experimental formations in the Japanese occupation in Manchukuo. And so what I'm suggesting here is, of course, the role that Japanese imperialism plays, both in terms of shaping the ethnic and the environmental boundaries of this place that we know today. And as for the soy itself, the genetic legacies of Japanese imperialism also live on there, despite the, the very quick collapse of it in 1945. China itself still uses the progeny of the yellow pearl, so now descendants of it, that they've continued to breed selectively into these newer varieties. And then also Brazil, currently the world's largest exporter of soy, involved in the rapid land clearances into the Amazon and creating these monoculture plantations, supposedly received some of its first batches of seeds from Manchuria in the 1930s. And some of the dynamics that we talked about today, in fact, are being replayed out there in these new commodity frontiers that are opening up. All right, thank you very much for your time. And with that, I will open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. We really enjoyed that a lot, and we will indeed open it up to Q&A. This always gets complicated on Zoom, but if you want to type in a question or raise your digital hand, or if I can see you raise your analog hand, we'll figure this out. But you can type questions into the chat or raise your hand, and please let me know if I'm not seeing someone. We have one hand. Yes. Sam Billing is one of our PhD students in the Department of the School of International Letters and Cultures. Sam, go ahead. You should be able to talk.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It just occurred to me that the time period you're discussing would overlap with the 30. I guess it's the 30s, right? So it's a time of ecological and economic devastation all over the place. So I was wondering to what degree that was, like, I don't know, a factor in Northeast Asia at that time and how that affected the whole story that you're telling.
So I want to hear more from you, Sam, actually. When you're thinking about ecological devastation, what sorts of places and what sorts of processes are you thinking about?
Well, I'm from Kansas, so
Okay.
originally, and I'm thinking about the Midwest or the Plains region. And since this area is a plain
Mhm.
at roughly the same latitude as Nebraska, I would think that there'd be some correlations there.
Sure. So when I'm thinking about, the Midwest in the 1930s, of course, what comes to mind is the Dust Bowl, right?
Right.
And thankfully, Manchuria escaped. It's not, I don't think it's quite as dry in some places. And of course, it's pretty dry the further out you go, but it thankfully did not experience a drought in the 1930s. So most of its problems were actually more economically related in the sense that it was being affected by the Great Depression, globally speaking, and how that was changing commodity prices. And so when the soy market collapsed, abroad, that of course impacted the farmers that were in Manchuria growing the soy. So thankfully, they didn't actually have to deal with droughts, although there were a couple of major floods that took place that did decimate the crop in 1932 to 1934. Now, I will say some of the dynamics that we see on the other side of the autonomous province border, like deeper into the steppe where soy couldn't grow, and they worked on improving sheep instead. Those dynamics really similar resonances to what was happening in, say, for example, Arizona. When I think of the book Dreaming of Sheep, which is basically about the 1930s sheep breeding and then sheep culling programs that was taking place on the Diné reservations or the Navajo reservations. So some of like the rationalization that was taking place of like, how can we organize nature in such a way that it is very predictable and then maximize that production, and then suddenly realize that you have to deal with like overgrazing and then the ecosystem kind of collapsing as a result of that. That was happening both in Inner Mongolia and in New Mexico and Arizona around the same time. So they're definitely like these the big ideas about improvement agriculture were definitely circulating throughout the world, as you could see, like the transfer that was taking place between Germany and England and the United States, and then subsequently to Japan and China. That those dynamics are taking place. I hope that answers some of your question.
No, that's some interesting perspective. Thank you.
No problem. Will, I think Angela or Angela.
Yeah, there's a question. So there's a question in the chat from Angela Bradstreet, and then a question from Holly Stevens. So maybe we'll just go in the order for it. So Angela's question deals with the process of creating the yellow pearl. When you say bread, is the yellow pearl genetically modified, or is this a hybridized, or how did we get king soya?
Yes, I did take a deep dive into that, because my very first question when I ran across the story of the yellow pearl was, wow, is this a GMO? It is not a GMO. GMOs really get started in the post-war period. So in some ways, this is kind of a different kind of predecessor to the kinds of plants and crops that are later being tinkered with. So when so Angela asked, when you say bread, what do you mean? So right, this is not a hybridized plant the way that you can hybridize sheep, which is happening at the same time that they're crossbreeding different merinos with native sheep to create like a new super sheep or something like that. This is, you are examining the soybeans that you see in your experimental farm station, and you're looking for the soybean that has like the biggest beans and then the greatest amount, and then taking those seeds and then planting those instead. And so it's selective in that way, but you're not actually seeing like crossing and hybridization that you begin to see in GMOs like until after the post-war period. Fantastic question.
So you got a question from Holly Stevens, and then Juliana. Holly, you should be able to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Sakura, for such a great presentation. So I have two questions. The first one, I'm curious if you see any change in this process after the establishment of Manchukuo, because obviously it starts earlier, and that was really fascinating to see the longer history. But I mean, once Japan is in control of the state, do you see any more concerted attempts to like try and direct what these farmers are doing? Because when they're just handing out their soybeans, it sounds like they don't have much control. But thinking about what the colonial government in Korea does, they do go on to like try and create these kind of organizations where they can manage farmer behavior and provide agricultural guidance and send technicians to households. So do you see that kind of change, or does it just continue to rely on like merchants and the individual motivations of farmers?
So that's your first question.
Yes. Do you want to answer that? And shall I?
Yeah, sure. I can answer that, and then we can move on to the second, or you can ask me the second. I don't know. I'll just answer it.
I'll ask the second, because then you can like think about it slowly. I was also curious about this overlapping area with like the soy cultivation and the Mongol lands.
Yes.
Was that like a deliberate strategy? Was there some aspect of land ownership or something that made it like particularly useful or possible for the government or farmers to like focus that as an area of cultivation? Or is that really just like an accident of geography almost, in that this had just happened to be the region that was most suited to soy production, and then they set up the railway line there, and it just happens to be the Mongol tribe lands? So those are my questions.
Okay. Yes. So the first question, oh man, if I gave you the full story, this talk would be like 3 hours long and bore everyone to tears. But yeah, so this is the story that I gave you really kind of ends in about 1930. What happens, of course, is that the Great Depression hits, the soy market actually briefly collapses, and Japan realizes that it can no longer solely rely on soy. It's still very much a major sector of the export for Manchukuo, but it's not the only one. And they begin to shift gears and to encourage wheat production more after 1931, especially to the north. And then, of course, Holly, as you suggested, the state becomes more interventionist in the sense of as Manchukuo begins to gear up for this war with China after 1937, the government sets up a Staple Products Association. It both deals with, financial, it tries to kind of intervene in the finances of local farmers, sets up these cooperatives to do so. Again, very similar to colonial Korea. And then as we enter into World War II, the Staple Products Association, it starts to set various quotas for how much grain and soy each farming community has to produce in order to contribute to the war effort. And this is where we begin to see some, it's already very coercive and awful to begin with, but this is where we start to see some really, really, the horrible effects of like starvation and black markets forming because people can't survive on the meager amounts of food that they have left over after handing over their harvest to the Japanese, and so that intensifies in the 1940s. So I will say that once Manchukuo as a client state is established, that allows for a greater penetration into sort of the lives of the farmers, but up until that point, you're right that it's sort of out of their control. With regard to the second question, that's fascinating. I don't think it was initially deliberate in the sense of, I think many of these Mongol princes and lords who had this land They, it was some of their best land that they would basically sell or rent out to these Chinese homesteaders because they themselves were in financial straits. And then because the herds themselves could survive on less fertile land, but it's really difficult to farm on, on the steppes. So in this way, animals get further marginalized into these less and less fertile places, whereas soy kind of takes over from there. And in many ways, I think the laying down of the railroad line was in fact deliberate, in the sense that it was meant to go through the richest part of the country, agriculturally speaking, because that way it could kind of, draw its crops pretty easily, and that sort of geographically speaking. So it's both like an accident, and then subsequently, I think, more of a planning, and that these kind of tend to like influence each other, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that fully answered the second part of the question.
It does, actually, because I also had a question about where some of these Chinese farmers come from. So you answered that too. So thank you.
Yeah. No, this is great. We'll continue to have conversations about, similarities and divergences with colonial Korea.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from our director, Professor Schober.
Hi there. So thank you very much for a really fascinating talk. And I'm really taken back by the careful descriptions you provided of sort of the infrastructure at multiple levels that was put in place to optimize this soy production. But I was also struck, and mind you, I'm not an East Asianist. My work is in Southeast Asia and Myanmar, and I certainly don't deal with agriculture. So forgive me if I'm asking you about things that are just beyond the scale of your work. But I'm wondering, on the one hand, I was struck by the sophistication of the international network that produced this kind of intensive and intentional hybridization of soybeans. You cited places of origins that were in Germany and in England. And so that makes me think there's quite a large network, a global network, if you will, that initially kind of supported this imperial expansion and colonial exploitation. So could you say a little bit more about how Japanese scientists who worked in this industrialized agribusiness related to the world beyond East Asia, maybe either the US or certainly Europe, as you mentioned. And do you have any insights of what those global networks might have been like, what those conversations were about, or what those kinds of collaborations dealt with?
Sure, yes. So unfortunately, I think that this is very much a story about the global North, right? In the sense that, and this is a very conventional narrative of, Japanese intellectuals really looking to Europe and the United States for models, and not really considering the rest of the world when they think about this. And so they're primarily looking to these places in terms of ideas about improvement. Now, that being said, of course, when we start looking on the ground in terms of what is happening in Europe and the United States, that many of these ideas are also being tested out in colonial spaces or colonial-like spaces, right? So that you see them happening, for example, like the British might test something out in India, or the United States might test something out in the American West, you know, on dispossessed
Sugar
territory.
plantations in Java. Yes.
Exactly, sugar plantations in Java, that sort of thing. So that's definitely happening. But like the ideas, they're seeing these ideas as if they are, you know, European or American, without realizing that there is somewhat of a negotiation taking place on the ground between unequal, you know, players, so to speak, between the colonized and the colonized. So there's that's happening. But then, you know, also, Eiichiro Azuma recently came out with a book, In Search of Our Frontier, which is about Japanese immigrants and agricultural expansion. So he's interested in these connections between Manchuria and Brazil and Taiwan and Hawaii. And you have a circulation of Japanese Americans who are, you know, going to the United States and then actually coming back to Manchuria or going to Brazil and taking these ideas along with them about agriculture. So that's happening. So those are the kinds of global circulations, I think, that are taking place. There's definitely more to your question, though. And so
you answered it in a very significant way, though, and it was a very broad question, and I don't know the answers myself, but thank you very much. This is food for thought.
Yeah.
So it's 11, so maybe we have time for one more question. I have a question from Professor Yuta Kru, who is a professor in the Japanese section. Judy, you should be able to talk, I think.
Yes, and I will. Yes, this was so interesting. Thank you so much. I'm also not I'm not a historian in any sense. I do more like linguistic anthropology. So this question might be a little bit far afield as well. But I was really curious when you were talking about the selenium deficiency disease that affected so many people, about how that condition created a particular set of imaginations about what was going on in the world. And the reason I think of this is because another person had asked a question about comparisons to the United States. And when you think about the Great Depression, yes, there's there's an economic component, but there's also there was a social imaginary of disaster that had to do with the world is ending. And we are the cause of the world ending, that led to a great deal of kind of religious revival and radicalism and so on. And so I'm curious about what happened socially when this disease struck, if anything, and how that would be maybe reflected in contemporary cultural texts of the time or things like that.
Yes, absolutely. And Cushan disease is much more of a footnote in this particular presentation than, you know, in the actual book itself. So thank you for the opportunity to go in deeper about this. But so as I had, you know, kind of mentioned earlier in the talk, that the Mongol lands especially was sort of seen as this reservoir for pneumonic plague. There is that cultural and social imagination of the Inner Mongolia and of Manchuria as, quote, a plague land. Ruth Rogaski has written about that, and her book is just about to come out on this later on in the spring. And so this idea of a plague land and this place where it's like perpetually like this diseased colony, so to speak, is, you know, in some ways reinforcing the colonial hierarchy or imaginary that Japanese have about this place. And that plays into this particular outbreak. When it happens in 1935, 1936, the Japanese are actually concerned that it's another plague outbreak. And what's really fascinating is that some of the people that are involved in investigating this are actually attached to the biological weapons program that Japan is developing at the same time. And so what you see here are people kind of doing both, like they're investigating it for, you know, for scientific reasons or like supposedly humanitarian reasons, but then they're also trying to take that information and potentially like use it against the Chinese population in these horrible ways. And so the the biological weapons program is actually much broader than just like the unit 731 that's being, that's been testing on the population itself, but is involved in these investigations of the plague. And so for that reason, it is terrifying. I wouldn't say that the people themselves saw it as world ending, but they certainly saw it as devastating to family lines, right? To like the inability of family lineages to continue, because it tended to target women of a particular reproductive age, and that was really terrifying because it meant no children, so to speak. And that has to do with the specifics of the disease that medical doctors to this day don't really fully understand why. Yeah, like I think there's this big social imaginary around the plague, around colonial hierarchies, and both of those kind of play into the ways in which these doctors are treating these patients, oftentimes Chinese women, really in objectifying ways that I think, of course, in current like medical practice or in ethics that we would not really, it's not very compatible with, what's going on in the world today. But absolutely. I hope that kind of answers some of what you're thinking about.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you again.
Yeah.
So we're at 11:10, so unfortunately, maybe we'll have to stop things here. But just once again, I want to thank you for a wonderful talk, a wonderful presentation, fantastic questions from the audience. We had a really diverse people from all over the university, from all over Arizona, from all over the world. So thank you all very much for taking part in this today. And I hope very much we can you can come out here in person sometime soon, from the land of the single digits to our land of the triple digits.